appreciate the opportunity to share what I've learned, and hope that you have a deeper appreciation for the traditions of not just the Kalinga people, but all the peoples of the Philippines who at one time tattooed. So I have a slideshow I'm going to share, and I'm still new at this technology, so let me make sure I can do this right. Okay. All right, so everyone can see that? All right. So many of you are already familiar with the Kalinga Batok, or the tattoos of the Kalinga people. A lot of people know that they tattooed and still do to a lesser degree, but many people don't know what it symbolizes, what it means, you know, what does it mean to have these marks on your body? And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So tattooing, just in general, is a tradition in the Philippines that's literally thousands of years old. Thousands of years, not hundreds of years, thousands of years. Some of the most ancient artifacts that we found in relationship to tattooing have been excavated in the Cagayan Valley in burial caves. And these implements were carbon dated at close to being 4,000 years old. So the practice is at least that old, if not older. When the Spaniards first came to the islands of the Philippines, or what we know of as the Philippines to this day, they first named it the Las Islas de los Pintados, the islands of the painted people, because everyone was tattooed that they could see. And so here are some, since we're speaking specifically about Kalinga tattooing today, these are some of the implements used in tattooing. There is a couple different names for the implements, and these are two of them, kisi or gisi. And the tool that you see on your left is made out of the horn of a nuang or carabao. And in the more recent times was lashed and put together with steel sewing needles. But prior to that, from what I understand, they were out of natural materials. The lemon thorn is one of those, or actually the pomelo thorn is one of the preferred thorns for tattooing. And that's what you see on the right of your screen. That particular kisi is made with a lemon thorn. It's just picked from a tree, pushed through a hole in a stick, usually rattan, and then dipped in ink, and it is used to puncture the skin and apply the marks. So a lot of people have a superficial understanding of what batok is about. They'll talk about, you know, people will talk about how they're marks of class and status or beauty, but they were the marks of the spiritual belief system of the Kalinga people. And if you understand that, to understand that, we need to know a little bit about the spiritual beliefs of the Kalinga people. Now, I'm going to be speaking in generalities. So if something is different in your particular village, that's because there's a different interpretation of these designs. And things sometimes vary from village to village even, not to mention the rest of the Cordillera and the rest of the Philippines. But in the belief system, there is a supreme being of sorts, Kabunyan. And under Kabunyan are various classes of spirits and beings. And we don't have time to enumerate very many of those or at all, but to give you a general understanding, there's several different types of spirits. We have embodied spirits, or humans. That's you and me. And then there are malevolent entities that have to be appeased, or you have to be protected from. You don't want to associate yourself with those would be bad. And then there's nature spirits, spirits of animals, plants, stones, the landscape. And then we also have Anito, what we would call Anito generally in the Philippines, or Ayan, Alan in in Itnog or in Ilocano. These are ancestor spirits that people generally want to communicate with. These are family members that have a vested interest in our welfare and well-being. And sometimes those spirits are able to influence the nature spirits. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, how this all works. So there are a few different animal representatives of these ancestors, and these are some of them. Generally speaking, throughout the Philippines, you've got snakes, birds, crocodiles, centipedes, lizards. There are others up in Cagayan. Even the starfish was considered an animal form of the anito. But these are some of just the general animals that were looked to as omen events. So the way that worked is, let's say that you've got a person and he's walking over to the nearby village. And he, along his path, he's very distracted by whatever he's thinking about, and these spirits want to communicate with him, but he may not necessarily be paying attention. And so it's kind of like, you know, when somebody's calling you on the phone and you're not picking up, then they start texting you and you're not picking up, and pretty soon they're getting worried about you and they might drive over and see what's going on. Well, this is similar to these ancestor spirits. They might be trying to warn this young man of something that's going to happen, or maybe there's enemy warriors up ahead. Maybe there's a dangerous landslide that's going to happen. He doesn't know. And so if he's not paying attention, what they'll do is they'll send one of their animal forms to come and cross his path. So here's my little snake, if you can see that. And if he encountered one of these omen animals, it could be the gayaman, the centipede, it could be a snake, it could be a particular bird. His responsibility was to observe that omen event and pay attention. In different places, sometimes having one of these animals cross your path was enough to just say, okay, something's wrong, I'm gonna go back home. Turn around, head the other way. In other parts, your responsibility was to speak to that animal, sometimes even as if it was your ancestor themselves, and address them as your ancestor and ask what they were trying to teach you or tell you. And so you would still your heart, your mind, go into maybe even a little bit of a meditative state and just see what thoughts come into your head. I compare this to when you're driving down the freeway. Sometimes you have this little inkling in the back of your mind that says, hey, Lane, you might want to take that earlier exit. And some people pay attention to that inner voice and others do not. This would be considered the voice of the ancestors, this intuitive, quiet voice. We always know when we didn't listen because we hit traffic. You know, you didn't take that exit, you hit traffic, or you get in an accident, or maybe get a ticket, and you're just kind of beating yourself up inside saying, oh man, if I just had taken that earlier exit, I would have avoided all of this. Listen to that inner voice. And so this is a way of practicing that. And so if you encountered one of these omen animals, your responsibility was to listen and see what that animal or that ancestor who is represented by that animal speaks to your heart and mind. It might be, go back home. You left the stove on. You're going to burn your house down. Maybe it's, go pick your son or daughter up from school early. Something bad's going to happen. Don't go to that party tomorrow night. You might have a bad feeling about going to a particular event. As we are receptive to these little flashes of inspiration from our ancestors, then we're guided in our journeys. So your job is to listen and to obey that prompting. A lot of people, they come to me and they say, hey, Lane, I heard that, you know, this tattoo means, you know, that I'll have this abundance of something or other, or I'll be prospered if I have this tattoo. And I have to tell them, you know, it's not really how it works. The tattoo in your skin isn't what brings you that prosperity. It's your receptivity to that inner voice that guides you into the most productive paths. And so that's how a lot of these designs work individually, but as a whole, they tell a different story. So here's one of the designs you see on this young man's chest. This is the typically described as python scales. And I have a hard time pronouncing Kalinga words sometimes, depending on the dialect. Down in Abra, they call this Min Manata, the same design, meaning many eyes. And what does this represent? Well, like we talked about before, there are these animal forms of the ancestors that reveal themselves to us. And the python is one of them. So these are python scales. And so if you had these designs on your body, every time you saw those designs, it was a reminder of your relationship to those ancestor spirits and to be mindful of them in their animal forms as the python, the snake. Down in Abra, they call this design Min Manata. And in Bontok, they have the same design. And they actually put dots in the center of these hexagons, like you see on the right of your screen. And when you put those dots in, you can see that it is like eyes. And that would explain the name for it in Abra of Min Manata, implying that there are many eyes watching you, watching over you. These could be the eyes of your ancestors. It could be the eyes of your village. It is a symbol of your relationship to your village or to your people, both seen and unseen. And so these are what some of these designs mean. One of the things that people ask me about too is getting batok for protection, spiritual protection. And here on the screen we have Apo Huang Od. You can see at the top of her forehead, very faint blue marks. And these are protective marks for women. And they're called Ling Ling Ao, to confuse. Means that's what it literally means, is to confuse a person. And you can see on this this Lola here on her forehead, she also has some marks as well. So what does it mean to confuse? Well, at significant stages in life, it could be at puberty, it could be before or after the birth of a child, women would receive these marks because it was thought that at those times they might be especially vulnerable to the influence of malevolent spirits. And the Ling Ling Ao confuses these spirits by changing the appearance of the woman. My belief is that it not only changes you physically by altering your appearance, but it also alters you spiritually. And this confuses the malevolent entities so they cannot harm you. You are a different person after having Ling Ling Ao put on you. And again, these are primarily, as far as I know, only for women to receive these marks. And they're used to protect a woman from the spirits of fallen enemy warriors, which are called Alan Alan, that dwell in the village. Sometimes, depending on the tradition, sometimes these spirits of fallen warriors are used as protectors in a village. But whatever the case, they're used to protect women from these potentially malevolent entities. And you can see that the woman on the left has several Ling Ling Ao on her face, the forehead, the temples, the cheeks, and on the chin. Sometimes it even put a little X shape right on the tip of the nose. And from what I've been told by some of my teachers, that is one of the most painful places to be tattooed, is right on the tip of your nose. But these are marks of protection. Again, these protective marks are dependent on what you understand about how these spirits behave. It's not just having them all by themselves protects you, it's the knowledge that goes along with it. Another tattoo that you see commonly in Kalinga Patok is the Biking or Wiing, or sometimes called the Jakrag or Chatlag. That's a Bontok term, it's Chatlag, Jakrag in places that are close to there. This is the symbol of the Maingor, the headhunter. And a lot of people ask me, what do these designs symbolize, this chess piece? And typically, most people just understand it as the mark of a headhunter. But there are some deeper explanations to this. One explanation is that it is the serpent eagle. The whole design itself, it represents this bird, which is also considered a form of anito, or ayan. So that's one of the interpretations of this chess piece that you see on this lakay right here. It is related, definitely related to headhunting. It is the mark of the headhunter. You would not want to take those marks on your body unless you had taken a human life. Apo Fong Od told me that those people that take these marks without having taken a human life would be cursed. They would be cursed with either insanity or a short life if you were to wear these unworthily. Now, how is this related to headhunting? Well, let me go back here one screen for a second. Let's talk about headhunting for a second. So some of these stories that we have in relationship to the Biking or Jatrag is, it's hard to understand them. Sometimes in different regions we have fragments of the same story. And when we compare similar stories throughout the Cordillera, so then we have a fuller understanding of what these stories or even the designs mean. So I'm going to tell you a little story associated with headhunting, but it's actually told from an Ifugao perspective. There's a remnant of this story in Kalinga, but it's not as full as the Ifugao version. In the Kalinga version, there's a story where this man was fighting enemy warriors, and he took many spears into his body, was wounded and died from all these spears in his body. His head was taken and planted, and from it, his grave grew a tree fern, one of those big giant ferns that we have up in the Cordillera. And but in the Ifugao version, it's a lot more detailed. In this story, Balitok, who is sometimes considered the son or the brother of Wigan, who is one of their main gods, Balitok was laying around the village, and the women of the village came up to him and said, "Stop being so lazy. You need to go do something." And so Balitok, he said, I guess I'll go headhunting. So he gathers a war party. They travel for a few days through the mountains until they get to an enemy village. And from that village emerges a man named Montinig. And they trade curses, they throw spears, and Montinig takes many spears into his body. He gets wounded several times. And so Balitok swoops down and grabs him by the head of the hair and cuts off his head. And as he lifts up the head to do the victory shout, to his surprise and shock and horror, Montinig's head shouts along with him in victory. Well, this is not normal. This is very disturbing. And so Balitok immediately digs a hole and buries Montinig's head. And they flee back to the village. Well, over 2 years pass. And at the end of that 2-year period, Balitok was sitting in the village wondering whatever happened to the head of Montinig. And so he makes the journey back down through the mountains to the place where he had buried Tinig's head. And he has found that from its grave has grown this large tree, large coconut tree. Now, if you see the tree ferns and the coconut trees, there is quite a bit of similarity there. And so Balitok climbs up the tree, he picks one of the fruits, he husks it, and he sees on the end of the fruit the face of Tinig. There's his face. So every time you see a coconut and you see the eyes and the mouth, you're looking into the face of Tinig, who was beheaded. There is a very similar story in Samoa. In Samoa, they tell a very similar story. In that story, though, we learn the context of why the women in the village were upset with Balitok for being lazy. In the Samoan version of this story, Sina, who sometimes is the wife or the sister or a close female relative to Maui, who is their equivalent of the Mawig. And like I mentioned before in the Ifugao version, Balitok is the brother sometimes of Wigan, who is also sometimes identified with Lumawig. Anyway, Sina goes down to a pool of water to bathe. And when she's in the water, she sees this monstrous eel in the water and it frightens her. So she climbs back out of this pool onto the bank. And to her surprise, the large eel wiggles up on land and transforms into a handsome young man. Not named Tinig, but a similar name, Tuna. And he beckons to her, says, "Please don't be afraid of me. Come back into this water with me. It's all right. I will not harm you." But when Sina returns to the water, he, in the Samoan translation, pierces her with his tail. Basically violates her. And so she goes home upset, crying, distraught, and this enrages Maui, who pursues this eel man throughout the islands, and when he finally catches him, beheads him, and brings his head back to the village and buries it. And then over the next few days, to their surprise, a plant grows from it and grows into a coconut tree. And like in the Ifugao version, they picked the fruit and found the face of Tuna. So what do these stories mean? What's the relevance? Is this just the savages' attempt of explaining how coconuts came to be? Of course not. We were not just simple savages. Our ancestors were actually very sophisticated people. And warfare. Headhunting was ritual warfare. It's very different from our modern warfare. And in the past, the Spaniards recorded how nearly everyone in the ancient Philippines headhunted. Kapapangans were known for being famous headhunters. The Spaniards were afraid of Cebuanos because they would take their heads in the night. Ilocanos were known for taking heads. So this is not something that is strictly a Cordilleran practice, but was something that was practiced throughout the Philippines at one time or another. It, to our Western sensibility, sounds barbaric, but this isn't. Blowing someone up with a mortar shell or a cannon, that's okay, but taking their head is barbaric. At least that's the way the Spaniards perceived it. Headhunting was a type of ritual warfare. And in the Bontot tradition, it's very interesting because in their practice of headhunting, they reenact that Ifugao story of Balitok taking a head. When they would go out headhunting, and a very similar practice to what we have in Kalinga, when they would go out headhunting, they would bring the head back to the village. And then they would hold a kanyao of sorts to celebrate not just the headhunters, the successful warriors, but also to celebrate the lives of those they had taken, the victims of that headhunting. In parts of Kalinga, they would actually make a little woven basket out of the end of bamboo, lined that basket with red hibiscus flowers and placed the head inside there. The men were allowed to wear red hibiscus in their hair or behind their ears if they were a successful member of that war party. But that kanyao is to celebrate the souls or the spirits of those who had died, the spirits of those they had killed. It's a very different perspective or look at one's enemy than in our modern warfare, where we just hate those people. And so the kanya was to celebrate not just the warriors, but those who had died. After that celebration in Bontok, the heads are taken and they are buried. And they are buried for 2 years, just like in the Ifugao tradition of Palito. At the end of that 2-year period, the skulls are unearthed, the jawbones are taken, usually for gansa handles, and that is when the men receive their tattoos. In other words, that is when the tree fern grows up or the coconut tree grows up on the man's body. So let me get a picture up here and go back here just a second to show you. So if you look at this design and understand that the torso is the trunk of the human body, those patterns that come up from the pectoral muscle and over the shoulder, those are described as the fronds of the tree fern in Kalinga tradition. This is when a man would receive these tattoos. So in effect, they reenact the story that is told in Ifugao. So let me just skip back ahead here. Sorry about that, my computer is a little bit slow. So these are traditions we should never take lightly. According to Apu Huang Od, you would never want to wear this design unless you had taken human life, because it is to honor the soul of that person who you have slain. If you have not slain anybody, who are you honoring? You're honoring nobody. In some parts of the Cordillera, in Ifugao, for example, these souls of these dead people who they had killed were basically adopted through rituals into the community. Instead of hating people, they accepted those enemy souls into their community. So these traditions are not something that you really want to take lightly. Again, there are curses attached to those who do not follow these traditions in the way that they're supposed to. One of the most destructive aspects of colonization is discounting our ancestors' tradition. Headhunting, there is much fewer loss of life than in modern warfare. Even if there's open battle, usually after a few people have been slain and their heads were taken, the winning side tells the losing side, you know what, you guys have had enough, go back to your village. We have no more quarrel with you. The balance has been restored. And that's what headhunting is really about. It's righting the wrongs of and recreating that balance between villages. And so we may think of headhunting as barbaric with our modern Western sensibilities, but really it is a more merciful form of warfare in that the loss of life is minimized. So my admonition to you today is remember who your ancestors are. Make them part of your history. Remember the roots that you belong to. I've often said a tree without roots dies. If we don't know the traditions of our ancestors, if we don't understand them, we really don't understand ourselves. And so search for your ancestors and let them find you. Pay attention to that inner voice. Pay attention to those promptings from the other side, and your life will be prospered and will be blessed. Thank you for your time. If you want to connect with me, you can find my books on Amazon, or you can find me on Facebook or Instagram under Lane Wilcken. Maraming salamat.
So this is part of my my upcoming ballet school, and here. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of my story, so if you get the context of what I'm speaking about. So like many of my generation, we came to the U.S. because of martial law, and we landed here in San Francisco, where my family lives in the Bay Area. The community that I grew up in was very multicultural. I had friends growing up from all over the world. But growing up, I went to festivals here in the Bay Area, but most of it it wasn't like how Pagdiriwang, where we had multicultural workshops or anything like that. It was mainly, we had like Gary Vee singing Michael Jackson songs, and We had, the usual lumpia and leche flan. It was more about the entertainment, the entertainment coming from the Philippines from a, Western lens. But growing up, I had some friends, Polynesian friends, and I was always envious of the way that their culture was, because they had their own dance. They were popular in school, and there was just something about their culture that I just seemed envious of, and I was even more envious because we looked alike, and we would get mistaken for each other, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. Until I went to Honolulu, to Waikiki specifically, as a kid on vacation with my family, and we went here across the street. It's different now if you go there, but it's the old international marketplace, and there were lots of Filipino, mainly Ilocano, and aunties there that would try and sell you things. But I went over there and I talked to them, and I talked to some local Hawaiian kids at an arcade that was in the back, and just being there, it was my first time. It seemed familiar because I've gone to the Philippines a lot of times as a kid, but not in a tropical area, right? It was mainly you're in Quezon City and the concrete jungle. But growing up in high school, I was listening to a lot of hip hop, and during that time, a lot of the hip hop music then was conscious. And when I say conscious, they talked about the issues of today. Like it was like Public Enemy talked about. They talked about the issues that are happening in the Black community. They talked about racism. They talked about the access to education. They talked about all these things, and so, I even Bob Marley was singing songs about burning and looting, right? In terms of the protest, and all of these musicians, albums led me to studying and learning about Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey, the Black Panthers, and I internalized that, and I started to think like, well, who in the Philippines or in the Filipino community is our Malcolm X, Marcus Garvey, Martin Luther King, et cetera, et cetera. And I saw parallels with the Black struggle with the Philippine struggle. I learned about, the Atas, and our indigenous Black brothers and sisters in the Philippines and how they were treated. I learned about the World Fair. So I made these correlations, and that got me looking more into our culture and getting the right mentality, the right lens as a Filipino American, as a Filipino in the diaspora. And we still have these issues today, right, in the Philippines, whether it's colorism. And at these festivals, I was first introduced to the script and some culture as well, where I found the script first in encyclopedia, looking at the flags, and I saw the Katipunan flag. And when I was at this festival, I saw the same flag I saw in the book. And if you see on the bottom left, you'll see that flag, and you see the sun, which is we're familiar with the 8 rays, right? The 8 rays are supposed to represent the 8 provinces that rebelled against Spain, but they left out any provinces down in the Visayas or Mindanao. And you see that character in the middle of the sun. And when I saw that, I thought it was the capital I, standing for independence, because I knew about Spain, and at the time, the lingua franca was Spanish. So I said, okay, it's independencia. But later I learned that it wasn't. I learned when I talked to the person that was running the booth, he told me that it was the letter K, and it was our old writing system. But at the time, there wasn't many books or resources. So I went to libraries all over San Francisco, my grandparents' books. I didn't really find anything about it. So my only reference was that K symbol, the Ka. So after high school, I went to the Philippines to find myself, to go on vacation, maybe for like extended vacation for maybe 6 months, but that ended up being 10 years. And the first place I went to is this old temple in Mandaluyong called Mega Mall. And the first couple books I picked up were, the history of the Filipino people, past revisited, because those were the things that I couldn't get here at the time. We didn't have ethnic studies when I was going to school here. And in these books, I found, a chart, and I had the chart of the script, but there wasn't that much historical context around it. It was just basically, here are the characters. And it was something like this. So I had the chart. I kind of knew the basic rules, but what else? And then what? When the internet came out, I looked up the script and I started to have conversations with Paul Morrow, and we became pen pals online via email. And what was interesting is that, I learned about the history and some of the cultural context about the script and our cultural practices. And it dawned on me one day, that I kind of looked him up. I said, who's this guy that I've been pen pals with for months? And I finally found a picture of him, and he was a white guy in Canada. And I was shocked because sometimes you see Filipinos with different names. And so it was sort of a metaphor, right? Of like, if you don't learn your culture, then you're gonna have to learn it from other people. And Paul, he's great. He's an amateur linguist, lives in Calgary, writes for a Filipino newspaper, plays in a Filipino rock band. And he was gracious enough to put these resources together to help me on my journey. So this is a napkin. When I lived in the Philippines, I would go to bars with my cousin and go out, and my cousins would then sometimes say, hey, to some strangers, mainly girls, would you like to have your name written in the old alphabet? My Amboy cousin, I was used to get their attention. So I would write names down on napkin, like this particular one says Nikki. I just hope that none of them got them tattooed, because I'm sure I got some wrong back then. And of course, being an American in the Philippines, and I graduated, folks were saying that I should work at a call center because you speak English. You could be a manager. But in my head, I was saying, no, I'm too good for that. I don't want to work at a call center. So I'm going to go back to the US, and I'm going to create some sort of big movement to teach culture. So I'm back in the US. I'm excited, but the only job that I could get, because I was living with my parents, was working at a call center. So I escaped the Philippines to go to the US to work at a call center. And so one of the first things I did, because I was, homesick and depressed, said, why not get a tattoo, when you're feeling down, right? So I contacted this artist named Alex Figueroa, who did a tattoo on my arm of my last name, Kabuay. And we had conversations around culture. And at the time, he said, yeah, you should post it up there. And so I did. I put it on MySpace, Friendster, and all these other websites that no longer exist. But I then created my own website, PinoyTattoos.com, just to upload a picture of that work that he did for me. And I started to get emails from people like, can you help me translate my name? My father was Filipino, passed away. I wanted something to remember him by. I grew up not knowing much about the Philippines, or I married a Filipina. I want to learn more about her culture. So it was during that time when I started to learn that there's something much deeper. It's not just about the writing. It's not about the artwork. But I didn't want it just to be around the cosmetics, the tattoos or the t-shirts. I want to talk about the economics of it, the social impacts, the community. And that's when I started baybayin.com. So this is some of the artwork that I've done. This is in virtual reality. And this has enabled me to travel all around and meet different communities, to speak all levels, all age groups. And so these are some of the projects I've worked on over the years. Published some books, apparel, move into the technology space. I had a translator in 2009. My current projects are on Instagram. So if you follow me on Instagram, you can find some of my filters. This is a flashcard filter where it tests you. So it will show a character, and then you have 3 seconds to guess whether you're right or wrong. I'm working on a documentary. And my latest adventure is Lane, who was just ahead of me, learning Batok for the past 7-8 years now. So this is Sulat School. So Sulat School is one of the components of Balay School. So Balay meaning home. You know, you may be more familiar with the term Bahay. So this is a portion of the upcoming Sulat School. So you may have seen this chart going around Facebook. Went viral maybe about a year and a half ago. And you'll notice, you'll see like up at the top, you know, you see Kulitan, Kurdita, Baybayin, Basahan, Badlit, Tagabanwa, Buhid, Hanunuo, and then you see Jawi, Kirim. So most of these, what you're seeing, with the exception of, say, Jawi and Kirim, they are all the same. We may hear some people like compare and say, no, the Baybayin, that's the Tagalog script. But in Bicolandia, we have Basahan. You know, in the Ilocos, we have Kurdita. But if you break down what this really means, is that within these charts that we have for historical reference that have been recycled since the early 1900s, we haven't really took a deep analysis on how this information was gathered. So they are broken down by the ethno-linguistic regions and the people that wrote these. And look at most of them that wrote them. Father Chirino, you know, there's Lopez. You know, most of the ones that wrote them, they're all friars. And so we don't know how they gathered these handwriting samples, right? Because we used to scratch on bamboo. Did we give a quill pen to somebody and say, here, write with this? So this is a way, when you do your field research, to gather the information. It does not mean that they are individual, separate writing systems. For example, Baybay, the root word is to spell. Baybayin is to spell, right? But you could also say surat, sulat, suyat, suat. That all means writing. Badlit, korlit, kurit, guhit means to mark, line, trace. It's all the same. They are more actions. They're not names. So the writing is what people call names. They're just description in their specific language or dialect. Here's an example. If take the Roman alphabet, are all these different writing systems? They're not. Like if I write the letter A here in San Francisco and somebody in Seattle writes the letter A, does that make that the San Francisco and the Seattle writing system? It doesn't. So in Europe, you have the French, right? The English, Italian, Spanish, they all use the Roman alphabet. So they have their different handwriting styles and maybe even country specific styles, you know, like the Black Gothic, you know, maybe more in, say, the German area. Doesn't make it a different writing system. So here are the basic characters. There are 3 vowels. This is A, E, and this is O or U, right? So each of them have like 2. So this one, E, I, O, U. So it's not just one, it can represent 2 sounds. And there's 14 consonants. This is Ba, Da, Ga, Ha, Ka, La, Ma, Na, Nga, Pa, Sa, Ta, Wa, Ya. That's it. Back then, our languages was much more simpler, and we had context to each other. But you may ask, like, well, how do we write the other characters? You know, what about the other sounds? And I'll get to that. But so if you notice, each character had the letter A attached to it, right? So let's read this. I can't see everybody, but I'm going to assume that you are going to read it. So ready? 1, 2, 3. Let's do it along. Ba, ka, wa, la, ka, ma, ga, wa. Pa, ra, ma, sa, ya, ka. Ta, wa, ka. Ha, ha, ha. Ta, wa, pa. Ha, ha, ha. Ta, ma, na. Pa, ra, ka, na, ta, nga. And this is what you just read. It's much more simpler, right? So yeah, baka, walaka, magawa. And I could translate it, but I think ask your friends. It's funny. Or we could discuss it later. Okay, so the way that you change the vowel sound, because each vowel sound has the letter a inherently attached to it, is called the kudlit. And remember, kudlit, guhit, means a mark. It could even from a tattooing perspective, tatak means a mark as well, a brand. So they're all interchangeable. If there's a dot at the top, it doesn't have to be red. That is just my purpose to clarify it. It is be or bi. If it's at the bottom, it's bo or bu. But you can see how now, though, when we speak English, right, how we can get the sounds mixed up when we try and write it in a Roman alphabet. So because the E or I character, right, is eh or E, but we don't have the long E sound. It's either eh or E. But when you try to write, say, bed sheet, we don't have a way to write E inherently in our indigenous writing system. And so even though people may not know how to write this anymore, the linguistics is still in the head, right? So that's why sometimes you see things like bed shit. And the way that you would cancel the vowel, so say you just want a single character, this is a virama, and this is an Indic word, and it literally means to pause, to stop. And what you're doing is pausing the vowel sound. This is one way to write it, and I personally like to do an X. The Spanish tried to introduce a cross. The Mangyans in Mindoro, they have it looks like a Nike swoosh, and they call it a pamudpud. So here are the other sounds. So basically the way you write it is by sound, not by spelling. So for example, Chris would be a K, but then with the C again, because C could be with it's not kekil, it's Cecil, so you do the sa. And here are the rest. Dia, dia, dio, dios, diolibi, a combination of two characters. So there are a couple ways to write. One is the traditional on the left is lakas, and the one on the right is also lakas. Traditional, you would just write the syllables, and on the right you would write the S for modern. Traditionally, we wrote only the syllables because we already had context to each other. So this part right here is called Beyond the Writing. And so I want to go back to not just the writing, but your cultural practice. What is your why? Why do you start to learn your culture? To learn my culture, make calligraphy art, meet new people, get a tattoo. You can segment it in these ways. One, is cosmetic. You buy shirt, buy artwork. Educational, which the part you're in right now, you'll buy books, workshops, discussions. Then you graduate to becoming a practitioner. You're actually, say, writing the script. You're actually taking Kali. You're actually dancing. Then an advocate, where you then conduct lectures, run workshops, write books, and activism. And you can separate these into further two segments. One is the consumer aspect, which is on the cosmetic and educational, meaning you're buying something. And then on the practitioner advocate side, you are the provider. You're the provider of either physical products or knowledge. And the job of the practitioners and advocates is to provide value to those that are in the cosmetic and educational tracks. So can you be an advocate without being a practitioner? Yes, you can, but as you know, how can you advocate for something effectively if you don't actually use it? And so I'm going to end it with the value trifecta. And I talked about value. So there's cultural, social, and economical. So cultural is easy. You know, you have your artifacts, this is easy. Cultural value, a given. Social value, something we take for granted, like, you know, the gathering that we have. You know, now that we're in shelter in place a lot, you know, we miss the social aspect of our cultural practice. Right now, we should all be in Seattle Center having fun. Economical, this is something is important as well. Say shirts, that is an economical value. There are different adoption priorities. Of course, you know, here in the US, we're more concerned of the cultural and social aspects because we have privilege we've either inherited or we've earned. But in the Philippines, it's different. Their concern is more economics. You may not have the privilege to practice your culture or to go to these events. You know, they go to school to not find themselves, right? They go to school, they do things primarily for an economical reason to survive. So I'm going to share this with you. It's a preservation formula to any cultural practice. V plus A equals P. All right, you got that? V plus A equals P. And that is V stands for value, you know, which is one of the three values. Is it cultural, social, economical? And then action. What is the action you're going to take from each of those values? And that equals preservation, because you're not going to preserve anything that does not have any value, right? You can say, oh, I love dancing. It's like, all right, cool. You're going to dance. And then when you dance, you take action. And that way you preserve it. So here's a further breakdown. So you have value, action, preservation right in the middle. So for example, cultural. Say you take cultural value, your cultural identity. You wear your clothing or your necklaces, or you know, you practice Kali. And that is your way of expressing your culture, right? And that leads to preservation. So social, say you value the social aspects. That is the value, right? What is action you can take from that if you value that? Then you produce events, right? And then that preserves. And last but not least, economics, apparel, or like you learn how to tattoo, right? And you have a small business around it that preserves it. So this was a really quick version of what I'm releasing under Balay School. You could go to balayschool.org, and I'll put the links in the chat after this. Enter your email and you'll get notified when it is released. You could follow me on social media. All my handles are there.